Are you thinking of moving from California to Minnesota? Or maybe you've been scrolling on Zillow and you're wondering why the heck that house is worth basically the cost of a small lake here in Minnesota. Well, today we are going to be doing a real side-by-side comparison of California versus Minnesota, and what your money actually gets you and how far it gets you in Minnesota compared to California. We're going to talk about housing, property taxes, lifestyle costs, everything that you may have questions on. We're going to be talking about it in this video, so stick around. You are not going to want to miss this. My name is Mackenzie Erasmus, your local real estate expert here in the Twin Cities, and I feel especially adequate to talk about this because I am licensed in 2 states, Minnesota and California. And I'm specifically with Engel and Volkers, Lake Minnetonka, and Engel and Volkers, Beverly Hills. So I know these 2 markets, and I'm going to talk about them in depth today, give you the inside scoop of what it's actually like to live in both of these places. Okay, so let's just start with the obvious, which are home prices. And yes, there is 100% sticker shock in both directions. The median home price in California is between $700,000 to $800,000 right now. In Minnesota, especially in the Twin Cities metro, it's closer to $400,000. That's about half the cost. That means that same home in LA or Bay Area could easily cost double, sometimes even triple, what it is in the Twin Cities. And what you'd pay for a comparable home here in Minneapolis, Maple Grove, Edina, some of the major hotspots here in the Twin Cities, are significantly better value than what you would find in similar hotspots in California. So if you're selling $1 million home, which by the way, friends, that sounds like a lot, but $1 million home really doesn't get you what you think it does. I remember when growing up thinking $1 million home was one with a giant pool and I had a butler and probably like a robot maid that would go around and clean all things. No, it's really just your average single family home. You know, think like Kevin McAllister, his home in Home Alone, which that also just had a recent sale, and that was in the millions, by the way, so just for comparison, and that's outside of Chicago. So if you sold that $1 million home in California, you could buy a beautiful newer build with a huge yard, heated garage, and you would still have room for a pontoon fund if you wanted to have that. Now let's talk about property taxes. Now a lot of people assume higher prices in California means higher taxes. And while that generally speaking is a good rule of thumb, that's not always the case because these 2 states do their property taxes differently. So California's property taxes look lower on paper. Okay, they're about 0.7% of assessed value. Now, the assessed value for California is usually what you paid for the home. But thanks to Proposition 13, by the way, that only goes up a small percentage each year that you own the home. So if you've owned your home for decades, your tax bill might be significantly lower than what your neighbor purchased it for. And that's why we're seeing some pretty big discrepancies on property taxes and why some people that have been in their homes for decades are not wanting to move because their property taxes would go up drastically by purchasing a new home. And that's a whole other problem, whole other kit and caboodle, as we say here. Now, the property taxes average, again, 1% of market value here in the Twin Cities. And that's a bit higher on paper, but because the actual property prices are lower, your actual bill is often less. So let's do the math. So let's say you have a house and it's worth $400,000 in Minnesota, and it's worth double, it's worth $800,000 in California. Now here, the property taxes are 1%, that's around $4,000 a year, and around 0.7% of the assessed value, that's around $5,600. So you're only looking at about a $1,500 increase, even though your purchase price is worth double the amount that it is here. So it's actually not as big of a discrepancy as most people think, and even though your rate is higher here in Minnesota, you're still going to see some relief there, 100%. And also, most people feel like Minnesotans feel like they get something for it, right? Whether that's going back into the schools or well-maintained roads or top-tier emergency services, they don't feel like they're just going up to the government and burning money. Although sometimes I do feel that way too, so I get it. Utilities and cost of living. Energy and utilities are cheaper here in Minnesota. That is 100%. In California, you can have 5 different utility companies all competing for your business, and yet you'll still lose power when someone sneezes near a transformer. Here in Minnesota, it is more centralized with fewer choices, but that actually does translate to lower rates. Groceries, insurance, and dining out all typically cost around 10 to 20% less, depending on where you go, here in Minnesota compared to some of the bigger cities in California. All right, now you've probably been waiting like he hasn't talked about the weather, he hasn't talked about the weather, he hasn't talked about the weather. Let's talk about the weather. So yes, California has sunshine, yes, it has all of that, but we actually have seasons. The first time I saw somebody with a pumpkin spice latte and it was 80 degrees out in California, I was like, this just is not working with my brain. When it gets cold here in Minnesota, it gets cold. And when it's warm here in Minnesota, it is absolutely perfect. You'll spend January in a puffer jacket. And I've talked about the polar vortex, by the way. If you haven't watched that video in which I've talked about the polar vortex, I'll link that one right there in that banner, so then you can go and take a look at that. If you're dealing with the polar vortex in January, then you'll have July at the lake, and it is absolutely perfect. And honestly, there is nothing like running around a Minneapolis trail in the fall with all of the colors changing and the leaves are peeking. It is perfect. Chef's kiss. Trust me, you want to move here just for that experience alone. Community and culture. Minnesota leans, I don't know how you want to put this, Midwestern grounded. And California definitely leans West Coast fast. Now, people here are proud, they're polite, and yes, sometimes Minnesota nice can translate into that Minnesota ice. People are afraid to be vulnerable and break that polite surface that you'll find the genuine people, the genuine interactions underneath that. But you do have to break past that Midwestern pride that is just too fearful to actually let you in because you're a stranger. Once you are through that though, you will find the most genuine and kind and loyal people you will ever meet. Once you are a part of the clan, you are in it and you will not be banished. So the bottom line is, if you're coming from California, here are the trade-offs. You will give up year-round sunshine. It's just the way of it, okay? But you'll gain space, affordability, community. You'll pay a bit more in your tax rate, your property tax rate, but you will pay less overall in the long run. You'll find that your money and your quality of life will go far beyond what you normally have to spend in some of the bigger cities in California. And it goes further here in the Twin Cities, frankly. So if you're curious about what this transition will look like, or you're curious about what your California budget could actually buy here in Minnesota, I am happy to help. Again, I'm Mackenzie Rasmus with Engel and Volkers, and I'd be more than happy to show you the differences in terms of your specific situation and why you would be able to make the move here or not. And hey, if you make it here, first round of hot dish is on me. All right, folks, that's it for me today. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.